Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CRS seminar, York University Initiatives in Syrian Refugee Resettlement, Lessons for Responses to the Current Crisis in Afghanistan. So I'm Sean Rehag. I'm the director of the Center for Refugee Studies and an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School. I'm delighted that you're all able to join us today to talk about this important issue. The Center for Refugee Studies has been receiving many inquiries from people at York, from people at other universities, asking us to participate in initiatives in response to the crisis in Afghanistan, asking us for advice about best practices in this area. The Center for Refugee Studies was heavily involved in several initiatives back in 2015, 2016, 2017 that were responding to the Syrian refugee crisis. And so one of the ways that we're trying to contribute to discussions at York University and elsewhere is to hold this event that seeks to learn some of the lessons from our past initiatives involving Syrian refugee resettlement, trying to think about what the implications might be for how universities might respond to the crisis in Afghanistan. I'm delighted that we have three speakers today who participated in York University initiatives in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. Our first speaker is John Carla, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at X University. John holds a PhD from York, from the Department of Political Science. He served as the project lead for York University's Syria Response and Refugee Initiative, which was, as you'll hear more about shortly, a refugee sponsorship and education initiative out of the Center for Refugee Studies from about 2015 to 2019. John's going to be speaking to us first. Then we're going to hear from Pierre-André Thériault. Pierre-André is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. He specializes in immigration and refugee law. Pierre-André obtained his doctorate from Osgoode Hall Law School, where he supervised law students working on refugee sponsorship applications in partnership with the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program, and he helped to organize York's Syria Response and Refugee Initiative. So we're going to hear from Pierre-André second. Finally, we're going to hear from Humaima Ashfaque, who is an A-IPC candidate with the CBIC, and she's also a first responder with the Canadian Red Cross's COVID-19 disaster management team. Humaima holds a Bachelor of Science from York's Global Health Program, and she was a project student ambassador for the university's Syria Response and Refugee Initiative. So we're going to hear from each of these three speakers, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A. So I understand that John is going to speak first. So John, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Just get my screen share going here. Great. So thank you, Sean. And I just wanted to mention that we are hoping as well in the discussion period to hear from those of you who are engaged in some refugee sponsorship initiatives. So maybe things that you've begun to do in the context of the Afghanistan refugee crisis, and that you're maybe looking for participants to join you, or you can share some current insights. So that's one other thing we're hoping to achieve. So for my talk, really, I'm here to share some of the insights and context for the sponsorship efforts we engaged in from 2015 to 2019. So to really familiarize you with some of that work, with a focus on sponsorship, of course, I wanted to provide some of the relevant context then and some of that now, and then talk about some of the activities and the lessons we drew from those for those who are interested in similar initiatives. So, I mean, the current context, I mean, a key point is really just the need is really great for sponsorship initiatives at this time. The UN data from last year, of course, over 80 million people displaced globally, and in Afghanistan, more than 5 million. And of course, that's increased. Sadly, the need is even greater than when we did our past modest efforts. As you can see from the graph here from the UNHCR, it seems, 15 to 20 million more displaced people since that time. So in that context, Canadian government pledges are currently to sponsor or to resettle 40,000 Afghan refugees. So I think we need to kind of keep this larger context in mind, but of course, every case and sponsorship matters. And unfortunately, with that 40,000 pledge, a lot of the key details are missing, and some of the policy asks around that. Some of you might want to check out a piece by Naomi Alboim recently, or in late August, in Policy Options around government policy. Now, some of the specific York responses then to the Syrian refugee crisis involved establishing what we came to call the Syria Response and Refugee Initiative, which we paired with a Refugees Welcome Here campaign as kind of an umbrella for some of the not explicitly sponsorship work. A huge part of that was joining the Ryerson Lifeline Syria Challenge, which I'll talk about, and supporting a number of York sponsorship teams and overall programming. York in this period also significantly increased its sponsorship of refugee students through its WUS committees. It increased the number of bursaries for refugee students, and it also launched what Pierre-Andre is going to talk about. It got engaged in the refugee sponsorship support program out of the law school, which was also a very important effort. So why would York kind of undertake this initiative? York institutionally has a lot of parts of the campus engaged in this type of work. Obviously, the Center for Refugee Studies, and this work was very strongly supported by former directors Jennifer Heineman and former acting director Christina Clark-Kazak. The president's office actually was the office that joined York with the Ryerson initiative, and also provided funding through the provost office, then Provost Rhonda Lenton. Osgoode Hall Law School provided funding and support, and as well by a number of sponsorship teams. You'll see a list. There was a great deal of interest campus-wide in these types of initiatives, and a desire to engage in this great experiential learning opportunity for students as well. And basically, ethically, and you've seen the numbers, that this was really the right thing to do at that time. And it'd be difficult to make the argument that the need isn't still there. But I won't reread Professor Sawson's quote. But we had a Syria response and refugee initiative as well, because we wanted to link refugee sponsorship and engagement as well to wider questions of education and solidarity. So the context for this is actually very important. I think we can learn quite a bit from this. For the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge that really started in June of 2015, and this started out of out of Ryerson and was led by Wendy Souquier, who was then the vice president of Ryerson, and a desire to see what can we do for Syrian refugees and how we can get engaged. And this is important because Ryerson really set up a strong and stable staff and support system for refugee sponsorship and its teams. They also facilitated the establishment of fundraising teams, as well as through Ryerson, the charitable receipt infrastructure that really helped teams with their fundraising and was a major incentive for donors to give, obviously. So that had followed on the heels of Lifeline Syria being established, which had pledged to by civil society to sponsor 1,000 Syrian refugees. And Lifeline Syria was important as well because they helped generate many of the cases that would be sponsored by groups, which is important if you want to have a larger sponsorship initiative. Obviously, you have to match sponsors to cases. And so between the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge, which was the university-based initiative, and Lifeline Syria, you had connections between civil society and the university to generate cases and sponsor. So these two organizations, are distinct entities. One was the university sector, one was civil society. But these two roles were very important. And then, so this started as a modest commitment of really now what we're calling X-University till they rename it, had initially said they would sponsor 10 Syrian families, but then with the publication of the photos of Alan Kurdi and the Canadian election and a pledge to sponsor or to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees, the interest really blew up. And in the end, the Lifeline Syria Challenge expanded to all of Toronto's universities, and by the end, raised more than $5 million and sponsored actually over 400 Syrian refugees by the end. So there are some lessons that'll be gained from this. I just want to note now that Wendy Suke again has gotten involved in launching now Lifeline Afghanistan out of the Diversity Institute at X-University, and it has many well-established partners. I think that work is still taking shape, but for those of you who are interested, it's something important to follow. And so from this, I think we can glean that there are several important facilitating factors to engaging in sponsorship efforts at the university level. One is really the interest of the university community to do this interest. You need sponsors who are willing to fundraise and really do the work of sponsorship on primarily a volunteer basis. And you also need a pool to be able to recruit sponsors if that's a major commitment your university undertakes. There's a need for executive leadership, really, I think, at the highest levels of universities. So with the York context, of course, which I'm most familiar, first, as I mentioned, our president signed on to this larger challenge to sponsor. The law school provided funding and support. The Center for Refugee Studies housed and supported this initiative, for nearly 4 years. And they're including hiring staff to oversee and support York's efforts, and as well as funding. And so there's really a need for a willingness to put human and financial resources in the form of staff and administrative support for these efforts. And so these efforts are very important. But so those are some of the internal factors, but not to be overlooked is really the external environment. And so government policies are really crucial in undertaking this work, because government policies can either open or close windows to sponsor, and it can facilitate or deter this type of work. For example, resettlement levels and commitments can vary over time. So the government can commit to fast processing of refugee sponsorship cases, or it could be very slow. So this could be months, which is reasonable to plan for, or many years for people to arrive, which poses many problems in terms of planning and organization. And the norm is for sponsorships to take years to process. Government policy also dictates who and how will people be resettled. Will it be government assisted refugees? In that case, the government is facilitating the supports, or would it be blended visa office? So this is kind of a joint effort between government and private sponsors, although private sponsors do most of the legwork and heavy lifting. Will it be privately sponsored refugees or some balance between them? This matters because, as I mentioned, you need to have the supply in crude terms of refugees to be sponsored. And so through the larger program we were part of, some of the teams actually ended up sponsoring BVOR cases. Another question, is the government facilitating the private sponsorship of refugees? So, for example, are those organizations facing caps on what they can do, or will governments temporarily lift or suspend those caps? This matters because it's much easier to actually engage in sponsorship if you're partnered to a sponsorship agreement holder, because they face less bureaucracy and really headaches in undergoing a sponsorship program when you compare it to, say, just a group of 5 people who get together to do a sponsorship. Is the government going to ask for UNHCR status certificates, which are actually a document kind of certifying your refugee status by the UN, which is actually very hard to implement. So there's many questions that determine, how quickly can people be sponsored, how many people can be sponsored. And so it's very important that anyone interested in sponsorship pay very close attention to the environment taking place. And policies can either be predictable or ad hoc. And as our program faced with the other universities we worked with, we dealt with very ad hoc policies. So the government from, basically December of 2015 until around March was being very facilitative, but then very kind of abruptly went from promising quick processing to getting back into the normal time of years of delay. And so this context is very important. And unfortunately, while the government's currently said they want to resettle 40,000 people, many of these details remain unclear. And so in terms of what York did in this context, we ultimately generated 10 sponsor teams. And I know there's several people on this call that were part of those teams. We ended up generating 2 fundraising teams. And so ultimately these teams who really did heavy lifting of this project resettled 42 refugees to Canada, mostly through sponsorship agreement holders who and then 1 case of blended visa office referrals, but others within the larger program ended up having to use the group of 5 structures. And I'll just note, our early cases kind of arrived within a year, but by the later period, you're into the years plural of waiting for people to arrive, which presents a number of obstacles, such as the turnover of your sponsor team cohesiveness. And then in terms of structure, each of the teams involved either a faculty or staff member, other members of the team, which could be from the wider community, students, in our case from York, and every team had a student from X university, in part because the charitable aspect of this was around experiential learning. And so the student engagement in this project was very important at the university level. So the activities that we did that really mattered, I think, were advocating for and providing advice and assistance and support to the York teams, especially if they had sponsor delays or to help with some fundraising. We organized a fair bit of educational programming for all of the teams around cultural learning, reflections from sponsors. We partnered with the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program on a number of educational sessions. because it takes a fair bit of understanding of how to do sponsorship properly. We engaged with York students, including the WUSC committees in these efforts, and we also helped recruit teams and match student volunteers to the teams on an ongoing basis. As I mentioned earlier, York increased its support of WUSC sponsorship. So York has 2 WUSC committees between the Kiel and Glendon campuses. So York actually really stepped up here from supporting 1 or 2 to 5 students per year, starting at that period. And this is really the longest running and stable campus-based sponsorship option. And WUSC in Canada, according to their website, has resettled more than 2,200 refugee students to Canada since 1978. And I think Humaima will talk about this, that they've issued a new call to campuses to sponsor more students amidst the situation in Afghanistan. We collaborated with many organizations I've mentioned. I think perhaps notably I haven't mentioned was the Canadian Council for Refugees and Amnesty Canada around some educational programming, and the Refugees Welcome Here campaign, whose kind of demands of more refugees, more fairness, and more welcoming communities helped us educate students about how refugees arrive and are treated in Canada, which of course involves refugee claimants. And then just to point to some further resources and information, our project website is still up. It's www.yorku.ca/refugees. There you can find many of the initiatives we did, our final report, and many more details on the matters that I've discussed. And so just the last 2 slides really are around some of the lessons learned from these initiatives. So planning and strategically, that resources and the stability of those resources were very crucial to at least have for the years of the project. Civil society networks and collaborations made a big difference in our programming, such as the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, the CCR, Amnesty, and university sponsor groups also can have some of their own dynamics, being made up of grad students, faculty, undergrad students. So reflecting on that in the university context is worth some time. And there's actually a publication on the CRS website about this from one of our events. Concerning student support and engagement, which is a huge part of any university-based programming, is that resources can really leverage the energies of students. Even modest amounts of resources, such as just booking rooms for students to collaborate on events, or we had our psychology graduate students, for example, had a training initiative for our sponsor groups, where all they wanted from us were some money for photocopies and book rooms. So you can really leverage the knowledge of students at the graduate and undergrad level. It's important, to open doors and help students navigate the university system, which can be very difficult, especially in your undergrad years where you're still figuring everything out. Now, these efforts involve time to listen and give mentorship, and it demands outreach to reach those students and to recognize what they've done. But the positives of this are tremendous enthusiasm and energy, such as fundraising through creative initiative, organizing events, novel ideas. For example, students at York founded a Refugee Awareness Week. They can show community leadership, as we did with Refugee Rights Month in the larger city of Toronto, or organizing a national youth conference for newcomer youth. Now, there can be, in the university context, significant challenges of turnover of students, but it's also true with sponsored groups if there are longer waits and coordination, although this is true for anyone. So the final points I would mention then is really a facilitative rather than obstructive policy environment is very important, especially for those of you who want to reach out to government in terms of policy asks of them to support your work. which I've mentioned. The uncertainties also require support. For example, advice on how to reach out to your MP to get information on a particular case, to help recruit new team members. Planning and strategic, then again, there's a need for resources and stable funding, civil society ties. There's a need for someone to, or an organization to facilitate matching. WUSC has long done this at the university level. The charitable receipt infrastructure, again, is a major asset, but that can take a lot of resources by university to facilitate. And then in student engagement, we've really touched upon. And that more, I'll just say that this can be an outstanding learning opportunity for your students. And so I'll end it there. Again, I would encourage you to check out our final report in our website and our former social media accounts. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Pierre-André, you're up.
All right, hi everyone. Let me just start trying to share my screen here. All right. Sean, can you give me a nod if this is working? Okay. All right. So thanks, Sean and Michelle and to CRS for inviting us to speak. As Sean mentioned in the intro, I was a SRRI co-lead with John Carla in the initial phases of the program, and I also taught a clinical course at Osgoode Law School as part of the initiative in partnership with the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program, so the Refugee SSP. York's partnership with the Refugee SSP is mainly what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll be, I think, rather brief to leave some time for the other speakers who talk more about the broader program. But as someone who is involved with the legal side of sponsorship, I will also just briefly touch upon some of the issues that John talked about earlier, about the temporary policy changes that allowed for the campus sponsorship program to exist in the first place. And I'm going to share a bit of information about what we know so far about the current program for Afghan refugees and what that may mean for campus sponsorship. So the refugee sponsorship program, the Refugee SSP, oh, I think this is probably blocking you. Is that better? There we go. Sorry about that. The Refugee Sponsorship Support Program was established in 2015 after the government's announcement of the Syrian refugee movement. It's a national organization that brings together sponsorship experts, pro bono lawyers, law students, and community organizations to offer direct support to Canadians seeking to sponsor refugees, providing them with assistance in filling out the forms, and also navigating the complex sponsorship process. In 2016, in the winter term, quickly, in just the weeks after the program was established, Osgoode established a course in partnership with the SSP that included 16 law students. They received in-class theoretical teaching and attended 3 clinics over the course of the semester, where they were matched with a sponsor group and Syrian refugee applicants abroad. The course was, the students worked directly on the sponsorship of over 200 refugees, including the refugee family that was ultimately sponsored by the Osgoode sponsorship team. The course was offered as such for only 1 semester, but in subsequent years, Osgoode continued its involvement with the refugee SSP through other mechanisms, namely the Community and Legal Services Program, or the CLASP Clinic at Osgoode, and also the Osgoode Public Interest Requirement. In preparing this talk and riffing on the experience with the course, I looked back at the students' end of term reflective papers and would like to just read a couple of quotes from the students because I think they're really, really instructive here. I found that students wrote about the positive impact of their participation with the refugee SSP in their development as legal professionals, but they also wrote about what they gain in working with the various community actors and the importance of advocacy. One student wrote, I became more attuned to learning about the larger picture and trying to understand the relationships between all the parties involved. I also became more cognizant to learning about the political dynamics at play in Canada's response to the crisis and how refugee advocacy will in many cases require a strong political component. But also students shared more critical views of the resettlement program, including their discomfort around issues of equity and vulnerability in refugee resettlement. For example, one student wrote, I was shocked to find out that Syrian refugees were having their applications processed in a matter of days. I found the disparity between the processing of Syrian refugees and that of dependents of inland refugees quite problematic. Most cases I worked on during the clinic were family members. I'm worried that this system guarantees that the wealthiest and most connected have a chance. With that in mind, I do want to move on sort of more specifically to the topic of today's seminar, which is thinking about the lessons learned from York's experience with campus sponsorship, and specifically here, the work that students did at Osgoode. I think the most important insight that I draw from that experience is that there's among students and the broader Osgoode and York communities great willingness and eagerness to get involved in refugee issues and refugee sponsorship in different ways. Osgoode organized the refugee SSP course, but the Osgoode community also led fundraising efforts and also sponsored a family, and that's just within the Syrian Refugee Initiative. There are a whole lot of other sort of refugee issues that are taken up at Osgoode. One of the challenges that as John alluded to earlier, that the program faced resulted from the government's ever-changing policies around resettlement of Syrian refugees. These changes required quick responses and also created unexpected delays. I just want to note here that the unpredictability in government policy also made organizing a course such as the one that existed in 2016 very challenging. To take advantage of a temporary window of opportunity, things needed to move very quickly. And that is not always easy in the university context, which is why it's crucial in my view that initiatives like this one have strong leadership support within the institution. And I think what ultimately made not only the course, but the overall initiative possible was leadership and institutional support and resources. The refugee SSP program at Osgoode was set up in a very short time because leadership at Osgoode, and I'm thinking about the dean of the law school at the time, Lawrence Sawson, leadership believed in the project and they decided to take on the challenge and support it with resources. Finally, I just want to echo what John said a bit earlier about difficulties around evolving policies. Just to note again that the processing delays are, I think, a major impediment to the establishment of a program like the one that we have. Cases can take 3 to 5 years to process. It's been a bit less in recent years, but it's still the processing times, the normal processing times are still quite long. Obviously, that creates tremendous challenges for refugees abroad, but also for sponsor groups, and especially for university sponsor groups, which can include students who may not be around for that long. As John said, the timelines for Syrian refugee applications were expedited. We still don't know if that is going to be the case for Afghan refugees, or whether they are going to follow sort of the same timeline as other refugee populations. John also mentioned the UNHCR documentation requirement and caps on sponsorship agreement holders. That's a bit more technical, I guess, but I guess the only thing to note here is that those two requirements pose extreme challenges. And in the case of the Syrian refugee movements, both requirements were waived, and we still don't know if they are going to be waived for Afghan refugees. Many in the sector were expecting an announcement from the government in recent years to this effect, but it has not happened. So all that to say that government policies are still evolving, and they have a great impact on campus sponsorship. And I think we also need to keep in mind that any window of opportunity for increased sponsorship for Afghan refugees will likely be temporary, and it's going to be important to be able to hit the ground running as much as possible. And this obviously requires institutional support, leadership, and resources. And finally, I just want to add that given this uncertainty around government policy, I think we should seriously consider directing our efforts and resources to the WUSC program, which is an established university sponsorship mechanism that doesn't depend, that is less vulnerable on government policy changes. And I'm not going to say more about the WUSC program because the next speaker, Humaima, is really the expert on WUSC at York. So those are my remarks. Thank you for your attention. And Humaima, the screen is yours.
Everyone, just give me 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen. Yes, no, I don't. Can you all see my screen?
It's still loading, Humaima.
Okay. I am so sorry. I'm just in a remote area right now, so I apologize for the internet connection issues.
I think we're having some trouble hearing you. Maybe if you turn your video off, we'll be able to hear your audio clearly.
I will do that. Okay. Can you hear me better now?
It does seem to be a little bit better. And we're seeing your screen now.
So as John and Pierre-Andre said, the three of us had worked on this project at different capacities. And my role basically with the project was also incorporating WUSC in this project and seeing the WUSC capacity at York and also getting to an engagement with this project. So I'm just gonna briefly talk about WUSC, the lesson that John already has mentioned some of it, and the Afghanistan crisis and what WUSC York is thinking and that could be done from WUSC Ottawa support and institutional support to kind of like facilitate some of the student sponsorships. So again, if people don't know, WUSC itself is a Canadian NGO organization that does international development work in many countries. And as people have mentioned before, John and Pierre-Andre, that it is a sponsorship agreement holder with the Canadian government. So it has a little bit of different policies and procedures when it comes to sponsoring refugees into Canada. And as mentioned, SRP program has been there since 1978. So approximately 150 students have been sponsored through WUSC into different universities and different campuses. And again, it identifies and facilitates in coordination with universities around Canada and the Canadian government. At WUSC York local team, which is the Kiel team, which is a team that there are two teams at York. There is the Glendon team and the Kiel campus team. At the Kiel team, we coordinate with WUSC headquarters and the administration. We raise funds and awareness for the program on the campus and their community. Again, we play a very critical role in offering day-to-day social and academic support. And again, we oversee the sponsored students' enrollment, educational supports, social support, psychosocial supports, anything on that end. And again, the goal is to provide adequate support, and ensure that the students are comfortable when they're in Canada as well. They're having a good time, because again, adjusting to a new environment and a new country under a whole different experience is a challenge for them. Sorry. Okay, and something else that some people may or may not know, that the students that do end up coming into Canada under the sponsorship, they do have transportation loans. And again, they are transportation loans. Again, they are the loan that the students have to pay back to the government for their flight and their for their flight into Canada, which is something that even now under circumstances, York University is still doing fundraising for the students that are currently on campus under the sponsorship. Through the project, WUSC York basically got a lot of community support and a lot of partnerships done. So WUSC itself was an organization on campus, but people weren't really aware of what WUSC is and what WUSC does and how WUSC functions and the capacity of WUSC. But through the project of Syria Sponsored Refugee Initiative, WUSC really got the name out there. WUSC really made connections with different on-campus organizations, different civil societies, as well as different departments that not have been that aware of, which is why the project was really crucial in putting the name of WUSC out there, as well as getting the students aware of how they can support on the ground, one-on-one resettlement. And the project was the Refugees Welcome Here campaign John had already talked about before. And again, it was a really good campaign because it was again targeting the negative opinions and the aspects of what people may think a refugee is and what refugees, who refugees are basically. Again, trainings that we've done before, because of the project, as John mentioned, it was really for us to have that not in funding, but institutional support in terms of providing bookings or providing resources, as well as, print out copies for people to come and attend the event. So we had social cultural training, we had advocacy training, and through this project, WUSC allowed WUSC and the general members themselves with the partnerships were allowed to educate a lot of different people on a lot of different refugee issues. So if they were going on in their lives to advocate for refugees, they were better prepared for that. Something that WUSC still does and is ongoing is that they do community engagements and community activities. Some of this has been ongoing for the past couple of years. It did start with the project support that we ended up having that connection with the local refugee center in Toronto. Then we were able to do winter clothing drive for those undocumented migrants and refugees and youth in that refugee center. I believe at this time, WUSC is also trying to do something similar to a clothing drive, or they are going to do some kind of donation drive for the Afghan refugees that are now coming into Canada. WUSC was also part of the conference through the project again, because the project had gotten the grants to do different kind and support to do different kind of youth-led activities. This was one of the projects that was done with WUSC and Amnesty being co-host. And again, it was a conference of more than 100 people, 100 youth who came to Toronto to talk about them and their barriers and how how we can adjust those and tackle those. Because of that conference, because of the support of the institution, York was given the national recognition because we had done referendum to change the levy funding. We had done conference, we had engaged a lot of students, and we have changed people's mindset about who and what a refugee is, which is why this award was given to the local committee at the time. So the effects of the project, there's a lot. So again, as I said, the awareness of the on the campus about WUSC and what WUSC does, but also on the broader level of refugee issues and human rights were basically they were multiplied, and a lot of people in different classes were able to understand what WUSC is and what WUSC did. Again, because of the project at the time, WUSC was also doing a referendum, which is basically they were trying to show the York administration that the students really want their tuition funding or the portion sponsorship. So it really helped at the undergraduate level to change people's mindset and allow more funding to WUSC, which is why now they have a little bit more funding to sponsor students following September 2021. Again, WUSC with its partner hosted workshops and trainings. They've done national conferences. Again, the work is not ended. WUSC still does refugee resettlement on campus, but the university support that WUSC gets is very minimum compared to what it could be and what it can be. And the reason I'm saying that is because the funding that the WUSC gets allows 4 students to be sponsored on 5 students to be sponsored on campus, 4 being Kiel, 1 being on the Glendon team. But it does not cover their transportation loan. It does not give them the flexibility to have emergency funding if need be. WUSC, as I mentioned, WUSC is still doing community engagements with FCJ Refugee Center, is still working with partners on campus to do donation drives for Afghan refugees currently in Toronto. So with the project, also with the project support, it gave WUSC more people power. And John had mentioned this briefly, that there's an issue with turnover, and a lot of the WUSC SRP coordinators or a lot of the WUSC staff, the WUSC students do end up graduating. Of course, everyone is busy. So this project really boosted WUSC's name out there. So if in the future people wanted to support refugees, they would be able to do it through WUSC. But now it's a little bit more trickier because, again, the pandemic effect also happened, and WUSC is not able to do a lot of groundwork they usually didn't back in the day. So they are also very thin stretched. WUSC student team, the general population and its partners when it came to refugee forced migration, the difference between government-assisted refugees and private-sponsored refugees, and obviously the sponsorship agreement holders. So again, campus allies supports the willingness and the flexibility of the staff, whether it be a Center for Refugee Studies and at different departments, allowed WUSC to be out there, but also allowed the conversations around refugee rights and refugee advocacy to keep on going on campus. And that is something that I hope for the future does stay ongoing. But again, for that to be done at WUSC or through WUSC's level, we would need a lot of support to do that. Sorry, one second. So as I mentioned, again, sponsorship. So actually WUSC is now doing 8 students of sponsorship. And what I mean by that is because of the whole COVID situation, there are 4 students who came in December 2020. Then there's the 4 students that came in September 2021. So the current WUSC team is doing sponsorship cycle for 8 students. And again, they're still continuing the transition loan campaign, which is a huge amount because now they're sponsoring or they're supporting 8 people. They had the referendum to change the levy, which was successful at the undergrad level. At the graduate level and at the faculty level, it was still a challenge, and it's still a challenge. So hopefully going forward, this could be changed and adjusted. WUSC could have sponsored more refugees or more students on campus. Again, the funding that we get from the tuition and from the tuition. And as John mentioned before, WUSC Ottawa at the national level has put a call out for universities, colleges, and their partners to support Afghan refugees through the SRP program. And as Pierre Andre said, that the sponsorship agreement holder is a little sponsorship agreement holder way of is a little bit of a different process than private sponsorship refugees applications. And this is something that WUSC Ottawa is willing to do if depending on the interest of the people in the universities and if they're able to do so. So we're looking, right, was discussion with different universities and their local teams to see if they're able to handle the capacity and if they're able to handle the funding required to sponsor additional individuals. And those individuals will primarily be Afghan students coming through WUSC Ottawa's sponsorship agreement holder program. Now moving on to Afghanistan focus, something up in discussions with WUSC Ottawa and WUSC York and myself was that sponsoring Afghan students on your campus is very much doable. And I do mean that because the capacity of our campus plus the capacity of our funding plus the students' support, we're able to pull this off. And the way we would be able to do this, or the way I feel like it's feasible, is having WUSC Ottawa do what they do with her team, with processing the individual applications and obviously doing funding pages, which is what I think is another idea that's doable. WUSC York definitely helped with resettlement, overseeing the sponsorship for those Afghan students. And WUSC York can be a secondary sponsor on those applications when one wants to do sponsorship. And WUSC, and I really hope so, the York University at the administration level is able to institutionalize some funding and allow additional students to be sponsored on campus. And what I mean by that is right now under WUSC contract with York University can only sponsor 4 students, and these are additional students that we will be sponsoring apart from the normal 4 students of cohort that we get. So the idea behind it is that it will be a student sponsorship through WUSC York with the help of WUSC Ottawa, and it will be specific individuals. It wouldn't be like a family sponsorship, but it will be, again, sponsorship of the students. And so the next steps that I think in my head is to identify individuals who want to do sponsorship, identify funding and do fundraising for 1-year settlement, and the amount for that is approximately $35,000. And then obviously, depending on the fundraising and individuals, so if we have a lot of individuals and we're able to fundraise for the amount, then definitely that is something that's doable. So if we have individuals, if we have funding, then we can definitely work with through WUSC York and actually sponsor these students on campus at York University. So yes, it's not a big scale project, but for the time being, this is something doable for short term, or again, it could be a long term thing with just doing students. It's not a family sponsorship, it's a student sponsorship, so it's a little bit different, but definitely something that could be pulled off. And if anyone has any questions, I would be open to those.
Thanks to the 3 of you for your presentations. We are going to open things up to questions in just a second, but I did just want to say a few words about some themes that I see as having come up in the various presentations. So I think all of the presentations included an enthusiasm for projects relating to resettling refugees, and also noted that there's enthusiasm at the university among students, among faculty, and among staff. The presentations all in various ways talked about the importance of leadership and of stable funding. So leadership might be at the student level, leadership might be at the senior level at York University, it might be within particular faculties, but it's hard to maintain the sites that move these things forward without having staff, without having resources. It's true that we can leverage student interest, and that sometimes it's just a matter of finding space for students and helping them navigate the institution. At the same time, the ability to have dedicated time for this by students who are being paid by staff members is really quite important for a number of these initiatives. Another key theme that arose was concerns around delays, the length of time that it takes to pursue these sponsorships, and the uncertainty around how exactly that's going to work, and the way that that links on to challenges in universities, particularly around kind of planning, if you're going to try to integrate some of these things into curricula, or concerns around turnover, particularly among students. And finally, something that came up a little bit was, I think, a tension between the idea of wanting to grab hold of moments where there's real kind of social and political interest in trying to assist particular groups of refugees, as was the case with Syrian refugees a few years ago, and as is now the case for Afghan refugees, but also the need to pay attention to other groups. The Afghan crisis is only one of several crises in the world that require responses. There are significant ongoing challenges in many regions of the world. I think of just Ethiopia and Eritrea, just to give one example of a migration crisis that's not getting the attention that it needs. along similar lines, there's a need to support people who are already here. So people who might be undocumented who are here, people who might be resettled refugees, so they've managed to obtain some degree of security and safety, but they still need lots of supports in order to thrive here. So there's a need, I think, to think carefully about how we want to engage with this specific opportunity, I think, while also thinking about how do we ensure that the work that we do also benefits other groups and has kind of long-term impact. So those were some of the things that I thought about as I was listening to our speakers. So now we have lots of time for questions. I'm going to open things up to the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. If you can't do that, you can just send me a chat message and I'll get you on the list. I did turn everyone's video off just to preserve bandwidth during the presentation. But if you'd like to turn your camera back on, you are welcome to do so now. So does anyone have a question to get us started? I'm going to give it just another couple of seconds, and if not, I'm going to ask a question. Harvey.
Put my video on. Doesn't matter. You did a great summary, Sean, and I really thank the three speakers. Because, you know, we're in health with a small informal working group, and we're just trying to get organized on short-term versus on longer-term plans and needs. And so learning more today what's happening across university is really helpful. But my question's really your fourth point, Sean. It's one that we're grappling with. Like, why Afghanistan, why now versus all of the other crises, things and needs? And it's a very important question. And something I grapple with a lot myself at a personal level and beyond. But I'm wondering if there's some advice on a guiding principle or principles that help us sort this out so that we're not doing more harm than good, and you know, not ignoring things while we're trying to help a particular group that's for a number of reasons getting much higher profile. So I'm just wondering in the sense of the guiding principles. So we have like a principled approach going forward, so that overall we can do the best we can with our limited resources, looking at it in the short term. And by that I look, you know, over this fall, the 3 or 4 months, versus for me a longer term is like 3 years. What can we do over the next 3 years sort of windows?
Thanks for the question. Do any of the speakers want to respond? Pierre-André.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. It's a difficult ethical question. And I think different people will have different ethical answers to the questions that you pose. But it's certainly an important question. And there's a debate about that among, you know, in the literature and in the sector. I can tell you how I approach it, but I don't mean to say that it's the only way to approach that question or that is the only right way. But I think it's important to be aware that resettlement policies and national refugee resettlement projects will for a number of reasons, focus on specific populations at specific times, and that's a bit of that is beyond our control. There are reasons of the government will cite reasons of efficiency sometimes to focus on specific populations with a specific commitment. I think in the end, I approach it from a very pragmatic perspective. If a window of opportunity opens up, I think it's important to take advantage of that window of opportunity while at the same time advocating in many other respects to expand that window of opportunity at as much as possible. And I think I try to do that in my own work. There are lots of ways to be involved in, you know, refugee resettlement advocacy beyond the specific refugee movement that the media is focusing on. But I think I certainly approach it from a pragmatic perspective to try to use the window of opportunity. And then also, I think those movements also often generate a lot of public support, which are in the end, like have a net positive benefit for the overall program. But it's really important, you're right, we cannot forget those other crises that go overlooked, and those aren't solved by just focusing on one population. Anyway, that's just my personal approach, but I welcome others to maybe share with their own perspective. Thank you.
Do either of other two speakers want to get in on this? Yeah, John?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. The points Harvey raised, and you did as well, Sean, in a bit of your summary, how there are many different situations that refugees and precarious migrants face. I thought for the project that we did, we tried to use sponsorship as well as a window into that type of awareness. So one of the activities we did with students was refugee advocacy training that we did in partnership with the Canadian Council for Refugees and Amnesty. And so that really, I think, helped the students learn about other situations. And that's how we ended up doing, for example, the winter clothing drive for the FCJ Refugee Center. But I think Harvey makes a very good point of we shouldn't just as institutions be responsive to these waves. I mean, that is the thought I had with the project I worked on. You know, eventually things wound down, but the need for resettlement, as that early chart I put up, has not diminished. So I think university supports for these things, you know, should be more ongoing. I think there is pragmatism to riding these waves of interest, though, because many people who sponsor will go on to sponsor again. And so, you know, catching people in that moment of public interest, trying to inject some of that education can make things more sustainable in the long run. And I'll leave it at that.
And just like two comments, very briefly, like as a student at York, and also working with the project, yes, you're right, we should not be focusing on one isolated or one specific crisis when there are multiple crises across the world, whether it be from the Kashmir to this to the situation in Yemen to Somalia, things like that. But I know, like generally with sponsorship, like that has been a one mechanism of allowing students from different crises to come to the program. Number two, at least as being a student at York, if I hadn't been getting involved with Center for Refugee Studies or with John's project, trust me when I say this, that I wouldn't know any of this information. And as a student at York, I think there's a lack of effort in different programs or in different classes that we don't even talk about these kind of resettlement issues or these kind of crises when people should be aware of them. Just my two thoughts.
And just from a broader CRS perspective, and this is a question that we often struggle with when particular movements are in the news. To what extent do we want to focus on those movements, and to what extent do we want to focus on other groups? Personally, the way I try to manage that is that I do try to engage with the groups that are getting the most attention, often because they're getting attention for a good reason. The situation in Afghanistan is shocking and requires a response. There's also a policy opportunity here. The fact that the government is taking action on this means that there's an opportunity for the university to contribute, and for research centers like CRS to contribute. So I do take those opportunities, but I think connecting those questions to broader questions is really important. So one practical strategy is, if you're going to pursue a particular initiative in response to Afghanistan, just think a little bit about how can you simultaneously push for other types of initiatives. Practically speaking, for example, last time UFA decided to step up and create a bursary for students who were without status here in Canada. It's not a zero-sum game. The interest that people had in engaging with refugee issues sensitized folks to these questions and prompted a broader response. So I would love to see people in the university pursue these things on parallel paths. Let's do something for Afghanistan, and let's think about how Afghanistan is just one example of a broad set of issues that the university needs to address. So we've got 3 speakers. First, Naomi, then Michaela, then Rob. So Naomi.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I missed the first speaker, so John, we'll catch up later, and I hope I'm not going to say anything that was already discussed. But I do think that it is, it's really important to take, it sounds awful, but it's true, to take advantage of crises to raise awareness on issues beyond just the individual crisis, but the bigger picture. But the individual crisis is what is in the public eye at the time, and is certainly what is in the government's eye at the time. And it is certainly possible to push the policy agenda on certain refugee movements, for example, that then can be generalized to others. It's unfortunate that the government seems to do things sort of piecemeal and one at a time, but there is absolutely no reason why they could not just have made it policy after the Syrian refugee movement to not require people to go through individual determinations for the Afghan movement. I mean, it worked with the Syrians, it can work with the Afghans. So I would say getting involved in sort of the refugee crisis of the day is not good if it becomes a flavor of the month, but is very good if you can build from that and generalize from that into more generalized policies for other refugee movements going forward. So that was just in response to Harvey's question. But I think what's happening now, if you do a compare and contrast between the Syrian movement and the Afghan movement, I think it's really interesting. I mean, with the Syrian movement also happened during an election, and it had a really important impact on all parties' views, and then on what the elected government decided to do in 2015. Unfortunately, in this election, it was not a high profile kind of issue the way it was in 2015. And although commitments were made, my feeling now, unfortunately, is that the government is hiding behind the caretaker provision to not do things that it should be doing now in the Afghan situation. And that's really problematic. So, I mean, there are all kinds of ways that not just in the government-assisted refugee program or the private sponsorship program, but there are all kinds of other pathways that could be used, and there are real barriers for all those other pathways. And the Afghan refugee movement could be a fabulous way to break down or remove some of those barriers. I mean, there is no reason why universities, I mean, in the Afghan population, you know, who are some of the people that are most affected are people that worked in universities in Afghanistan. I mean, if every university in Canada would take it upon themselves to offer jobs to some of the Afghan scholars, even if it was, you know, temporary positions so they could come here on TRPs and then apply for permanent residence while they're here, that would be a wonderful precedent to set. International students could be offered all kinds of positions and then come here and then apply for transition to permanent residency once they're here. But the problem is the dual intent craziness, where people have to demonstrate that there's no, you know, nothing to prevent them from going home after they're here on a TRP. I mean, that's a policy change that really has to change, because we know that the government is interested in two-step immigration, both for TFWs and for international students. Why can't they do it for people who are facing real danger at home? Come here temporarily and then transition from here. If we could make those kinds of policy changes, and with the university playing a lead in bringing in international students or bringing in lecturers, for example, as temporary workers, and then assisting them to transition, that I think would be quite wonderful, and it would be really helpful for the Afghan situation, but then is something that could be used for other situations going forward. Just an example of that maybe could be pursued.
Thanks, Naomi. And one of the things we haven't talked about is the Scholars at Risk program here at York, which is another framework that can be pursued. What I'm going to suggest that we do is that we hear from, there are 3 people who asked questions, so let's hear from everyone, and then we'll go back to the speakers. So Michaela, you're next.
I'm going to say thanks to the speakers, and also thanks to Naomi for those really great suggestions. And I really like some of the concrete suggestions that are being made around creating some kind of more permanent, sustainable pathways that could be utilized across a number of circumstances. I wanted to comment about WUSC as one of the possibilities for increasing and facilitating sponsorship. And I think what I liked about the presentation today was that it really highlighted how hard it is to plan an institutional response when you have unpredictable pathways, when it's difficult to know who's coming, when they're coming, and how many people will come. And how one of the things that WUSC has been able to do is to ensure that there is a predictable path of sponsorship that is available that institutions could respond to. And I feel there's a bit of a gap in our requests that the institution support WUSC and the students who do the sponsorship, and what's actually required of the students doing the sponsorship. And so I would like to have the speakers think about a better developed support strategy for the WUSC initiative. So it's not just around, can we provide a little more money, but also how can we provide more pathways to bring in more of those student sponsors so that we respect the really challenging work that's being asked of the students who do the sponsorship. As Humaima pointed out, there are currently 8 students being sponsored by the WUSC committee. How are we supporting those students doing all of that work right now? And are there ways of building that into our faculties, into our courses, so that we recruit more students to do that kind of sponsorship work in a more predictable, steady, ongoing way, so that we can really build stronger sponsorship teams? Thanks.
Thanks, Michaela. And Michaela didn't mention that she's one of the faculty who assist with WUSC. So thanks for your work on that as well. Rob.
Hi. Hi, I can't get my video going, sorry, but there it is. Hi, yeah, thanks everyone for this informative session. I'm a music professor, and we were contacted by the Afghan National Institute of Music to assist them with musicians who are in more danger. Well, there's a lot of people in dangerous positions in Afghanistan, but particularly young female musicians of the Institute face particular threats. And this is an old cultural dilemma in Islam with the legal position of music. So it's not anything new, but the Taliban in the past has had a bad track record with this. And anyways, just showing how random things occur and how we got involved. It's expanded to many university music programs who feel we want to show solidarity and support these musicians. And we just had a meeting with Chris Eaton and the chairs of Arts, Media, Performance and Design. And we have good leadership commitment here. And we're starting to look at funding from various community players. And it seems that WUSC is the best way to enact this. So we went from something that was very specific with trying to get as many as a one-off thing for our music department, for students to come to our music department, and we're looking at a more now a more long-term sustainable effort. And I totally agree with the ethical problems. We have empires roaring in and out of places, creating a mess, and then there's people like ourselves trying to help. The need is endless, but there's an opportunity here where we were actually called out to do this. And so we're just going to step up and do what we can. So we're learning as we go. And we've been in touch with Vinitha, who in the earlier period gave us some great orienting information. But we're just wondering what the next step is for us now that we've got a few things in place. And tomorrow there's going to be a meeting with about 4 different music departments for this effort that's really targeting musicians who are at risk in Afghanistan. And yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out to the people here who are involved and ask what advice you may have for the next step. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Rob. And if anyone is involved in any other initiatives that haven't been talked about, if you wanted to write, just describe that in the chat so that we can all kind of see what's going on, I think that would be helpful for this conversation. Terry.
Hi, thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody. I'm Terry Maley. I'm the Vice President of UFA. And I was only able to join the meeting late, so I may have missed some of the earlier discussion and presentations. But I just wanted to comment briefly on exactly the point that Naomi made, and indirectly on the issue that Pierre-Andre raised earlier about the ethical issues and whatnot. But the short version of the story, which is indirectly related to the discussion today, but has a connection to it certainly. Naomi's point, is that 3 or 4 years ago, UFA responded to a number of our members, mostly in the LAPS faculty, in the liberal arts and professional studies faculty, to a number of colleagues, many colleagues who came to us and said, can we do something about helping scholars from Turkey who are in difficulty? And so we looked into it and found out that York was already a member of the Scholars at Risk network that Sean mentioned. And we got a group together that I was sort of chairing for the past 3 or 4 years that's taken a bit of a break over the COVID period, but has been activated again or reactivated by the discussion around colleagues and women colleagues in particular from Afghanistan. So Naomi, on the point that you mentioned, the short version of the story is that what we managed to work out was that in our collective agreement, the UFA, the full-time faculty collective agreement, there is a clause that allows UFA to bring in visiting scholars a year. And we connected with the senior administration from this ad hoc committee or working group that we've had the past 4 years, and managed to convince them to support out of a number of positions that are in the collective agreement already that are there and that weren't being fully utilized. We managed to get the university to agree, the senior administration to agree that they would support a couple of Scholars at Risk scholars per year. And so we managed to bring 2 per year. In fact, last year I think it was 3, not only from Turkey, but from a couple of other countries as well, but mostly from Turkey over the past few years. And that has led to, Naomi's point, that has led to a couple of those scholars coming for 1 or 2 year terms and then getting permanent residency, getting PR as well. Not all of them have, but that's worked out in a couple of cases. So that's addresses exactly the point that Naomi raised. So there's something in place, but it's been thus far, it's taken a bit of a break. York is part of the Scholars at Risk Canada network, and we've had some of our colleagues go to SAR Canada workshops and seminars and whatnot. And that's been very helpful on that front as well. But we're trying to reconvene and reconstitute so that we can figure out what to do. But in response to the question of the ethical question of, do you respond to the crisis at hand, or the most recent or immediate crisis, that's sort of what happened a few years ago, before UFA was plugged into this, and before colleagues where they just saw the crisis in Turkey and said, and there were questions that were asked exactly along those lines at the time. Why only colleagues from a particular area, a particular country at this particular moment? And those were exactly the kinds of questions we discussed. And we decided at that point to try to help those colleagues. And the administration agreed as well, because there was a need. Of course, there's a much broader need that's very considerable or substantial from multiple locations globally, of course, all the time on a continuing basis. But that particular situation of those colleagues coming to UFA and saying, can you assist with this? And then us as a UFA group going to the administration saying, can you assist with this? Worked out in that instance. And we're trying to do that again for in the current moment for Afghanistan, with those other ethical issues in mind. What we're trying to do now is we've got a terms of reference document together, because the committee or the group has been ad hoc thus far. And we've got a terms of reference document together that we're moving up to the dean and the provost, and trying to establish it on a more permanent basis, where we need to consider some of those ethical issues on a more permanent basis, so that it's not just the crisis of the month or the year that's addressed. But at the moment, that's what we're doing, and we've reconstituted that. And in terms of the undergraduate dimension, they're at other places and in other countries. SAR is a network, sort of go on for a bit, but SAR is a network that extends across many countries, even though it's headquartered in New York. And in other countries and some other universities, there are undergraduate initiatives, and some undergrads have come to us just this past month or so and said they'd like to be involved in a Scholars at Risk undergraduate support network as well. So we're meeting soon. Anyone who'd like to come, just send me an email, Mailey@yorku.ca, who'd like to be involved in the Scholars at Risk effort at York. But it's related, as to say, not exactly the same as what you're talking about, but related to it. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Terry. And it's great to hear that that's being put on a more solid, stable footing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to go back to the speakers. Don't feel obliged to answer all of the questions, but if you have some kind of concluding thoughts that might tie some of the questions into one another, now is your opportunity. So why don't we start with John?
Sure. So maybe the two things I could mention are this discussion of the kind of waves of enthusiasm, as well as Michaela's point about, or question of how we ensure more support for the students who are undertaking sponsorships. I mean, one is, I guess we need many more Michaelas. Michaela is is the faculty advisor to the WUSC Kiel committee, and those are tremendously important roles for mentorship and support. It's Terry, who's here from UFA. It made me wonder if there should maybe be a call out to UFA for faculty that want to support these types of efforts. And then perhaps, with WUSC, there's some question perhaps as a model if getting more departments involved in WUSC. For York, the size of it that it is, it's great to sponsor 5 students a year, but maybe there is some kind of more dispersed model rooted in faculties and departments where there are those more organic ties. But in general, in terms of supporting the students, I think there needs to be some funded support. Like I know during our project, we helped quite a bit with recruitment, tying WUSC to some training, participating in getting them some of their efforts recognized. And there are many students who would probably get involved in WUSC, but they don't know about it. So, recruitment and training is really an ongoing thing. And if you rely purely on volunteerism, it's very tough to sustain. And on some campuses, WUSC committees almost die till enthusiasm comes again, and then they can regenerate. Like even they can go from 0 to committees of the year, in a couple of years. So the institutional support there, I would say, is important, and is maybe the biggest take-home message, I would say.
Thanks, John. Pierre-André?
Sure, maybe just a couple of things. First, to Naomi's point about leveraging enthusiasm and then expanding. I just wanted to mention that the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program was initially formed for the refugee population, the Syrian refugee population after the federal government's announcement, but has since expanded to support all refugee populations. So I think that's kind of a very good example of how interest within the legal profession specifically was leveraged and then kind of expanded to all populations. And absolutely, you're right. Also with the awareness around the Afghan refugee situation, we've now seen an increase in lawyers who want to get involved. I also think that the recent sort of increase in the overall number of refugees that come in through the resettlement is kind of a product of the enthusiasm around private sponsorship. So I think it ended up very much sort of trickling down to other refugee populations in that way. Maybe also just another comment to Rob. It sounds like you have lots of interest happening in your great projects in your department. I think even maybe we emailed in the past and we were talking about the fact that the current government policy doesn't allow for the sponsorship of people who are still in Afghanistan. There's a special humanitarian program for people still in Afghanistan, but it concerns people who have been involved with the Canadian government or Canadian forces. But anyway, just from hearing your talk, it certainly sounds like there could be something, a partnership with WISC. And I encourage you to take that up. Thank you.
And Humaima.
Just adding on to what Michaela said, I mean, we try to have the discussion at the faculty level to do a faculty levy, at least that way we can increase the number of sponsorship in terms of from 4 to 5 or to 6. And in terms of student building, like there are a lot of programs at York that within the department themselves that can say that, hey, for this class project, we're going to dedicate X amount of hours, or people have to do extracurricular activities or practicum hours, things like that. I know that is something that we could do at least at the global health program when we're doing our practicums for our projects. At least that way we could help support WUS to some capacity. WUSC Ottawa is still very much interested in doing Afghan student sponsorship if that is still possible and people are still interested in doing that. I have sent my email on the chat. If this is something that you want to partner with WUSC York to do student sponsorship, you can always send me an email and we can facilitate those discussions with WUSC Ottawa. Again, the idea behind it again is that WUSC Ottawa will do the applications, and as long as we have the fundraising and the people to support it, WUSC Ottawa will handle the applications. And from our discussions, WUSC Ottawa is looking to do sponsorship as early as 2022. I don't know if that means January semester or the spring semester, but they're definitely looking to do it. That's just my 2 cents.
Great. Well, thank you so much to John, Pierre-André, and Humaima for leading us through this this conversation. One of my favorite things about being the director at CRS is the opportunity to engage with students who are committed to doing work that involves forced migration and other displaced people. And I'm mindful that our 3 speakers today helped to lead York's initiatives in response to the Syrian refugee movement, all during periods when they were students. And they've all gone on to continue doing work in this area and to continue supporting other groups of refugees. And so I think this is a great example of how York, if we invest in our students, because we did provide funding so that folks could do some paid work in this area. If we invest in our students and we support our students, there's really a lot that can be accomplished both in the short term and in the long term. So I guess I would leave everyone with the pitch of we've got this amazing resource of great students who have lots of energy. I think it's a matter of figuring out how do we create the structures to support those students, to make their initiatives sustainable, and to encourage ways of moving beyond responses to immediate crises to more generalized, longer-term responses. So thanks again to our speakers and to everyone for participating today.